Ahoy, adventurers! Joe Buddy Hambone here with another coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the code is ROLLDICE, and it is good through September 7th for $6 off orders of $25 or more, either online or in person. Now, you heard me right. It is $6 off orders of $25 or more, either online or in person, using the code ROLLDICE. And hey, it's back to school season, so if you're already out there picking up some pencils and papers, why not get yourself a new set of dice or maybe a brand new RPG to kick the fall season off right? Use the code ROLLDICE. And if you're shopping at Noble Knight Games already, on August the 10th, which is the day this episode airs, Noble Knight Games is doing their free RPG Day online event. They're kicking it off with a special deal that for every $15 you spend, you can obtain any of the RPG Day promo items for only a penny. Be sure to check out their website for more details on that. And don't forget to use the code ROLLDICE to get $6 off an order of $25 or more, either online or in person, now through September 7th, from your friends and mine, Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He told me today's episode is about lions, and none of them are named Aslan, Lion-O, or Simba. Stu Horvath.
That's true. In fact, the lions aren't named at all.
Those are the only three lions I know off the top of my head, and were relatable to pop culture. How you doing today, Stu?
Pretty good. I feel like there's another major lion that you left out, but I'm not going to waste our time trying to figure out what it is.
It'll probably come to me later in the episode.
Yeah.
So, Stu, today we are talking about Three Hearts and Three Lions.
We are by Poul Anderson. It might just be Paul Anderson, but the O in there makes me go Poul. I don't know. What do you think? What's your opinion?
I feel like it's said like Poul. Like if I was going to do like an accent, like trying to do a very bad English accent, it's Poul. It's my friend Poul.
So it's a science fantasy novel, weird thing from 1961. It was the second tier of the Appendix N books. Like you have your Elric and your Lovecraft and your Tolkien, right? They're like the A team. And then there's these often referenced, B team books that are a little bit more obscure, but like people who are Appendix N nerds are really into them and see them as really important. I think that this is firmly in the second tier. I don't think that Poul Anderson is like a household name in the way that Tolkien is.
So you're saying this is more on the level of the Shadow People?
Yeah, I mean, maybe even above the Shadow People. I feel like there's like a third tier too, which the Shadow People is sort of on, where it's like nobody knows Margaret St. Clair,
Oh, man. To find your life on the D list of Appendix N.
Like there's certain names that you gravitate to. Like Poul Anderson is more of a science fiction author, which is unfair. I mean, he wrote all sorts of stuff. But like I think of him as a science fiction author. So I'd be less inclined as a kid to pick up those books because they looked science fiction and I was never really a sci-fi kid. Having actually picked this up and read it finally, I was like, oh wow, yeah, this is super important to D&D. Like, should have read this years ago. So because it's like 1961 and it's like science fiction and fantasy, like there's no real distinction between those things. Like this book is a little bit weirder and a little bit more ridiculous than it really needs to be. So the plot involves a Danish fella named Holger Karlsson, right?
That's a good like Danish guy name in the 60s.
Yeah, and he's a big, tall, doofy guy, and he's also like a physicist. But he's not a really good physicist, like serviceable physicist, not a brilliant guy at all. But then World War II starts and he kind of gets like the Danish patriotism and goes back to Denmark to fight in the resistance against the Nazis after Germany takes over. As a resistance fighter, he's involved with spiriting Niels Bohr out of the country. And during that operation, he gets shot in the head and falls unconscious and wakes up in a forest in what is essentially like the borderland between the real medieval world and the fairy realms. Are you still with me, Hambone?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around this as far as like what is considered serviceable. Like, does that mean like I actually read the book and you didn't, so I'm fine, but not actually good at my job?
Yeah, he's fine. He's not Einstein, but like he's doing experiments and stuff.
He knows which buttons to push.
Yeah.
So let me get this straight. He catches the patriotism bug.
Yeah.
He goes back to his home country.
Yeah.
Gets shot in the head.
Yeah.
And wakes up in the Fey world.
Basically, yeah. He stands up and there's a horse there and a suit of armor and a shield and a sword, and it all fits him perfectly, which is unusual because in medieval times people were shorter. So the fact that this 6'3" Goonie looking guy could fit into this stuff, and the horse likes him, so all of those things conspire to make this feel very odd. It's the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court setup, except he's a scientist. And in the text of the book, they even, reuse one of the gags that the Connecticut Yankee uses and calls it out as such. Like he's doing this based on what he read in that book, the Mark Twain novel.
So this is like an OG callback. Like a lot of times when you see those references made in movies, like, oh, they make a Star Wars reference because it's the commonality that everyone knows. Like everyone has seen Star Wars.
Yeah.
So at this point, like everybody's read a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. So they're just going to know. Like I don't need to actually write my way through this. I'm just going to make the reference.
Yep.
I'm going to leave it right there on the page. Keep moving.
And I think that this is like dumb. It just pushes what I want out of a novel to the side. It's such an obviously fictional construction. This guy gets shot in the head and transported back into the medieval world. And now he's a fish out of water, but he also kind of knows Latin and stuff. And like he's suddenly Catholic feeling, even though he was like ambivalent in our world. And he's a good fighter because like his reflexes take over. I just think all of that's kind of dumb. It doesn't work for me.
It sounds like fan fiction to me.
I don't think that this is like that, but it totally feels like what we think of as a self-insert now. And that's one of the things that I think might grate on me as a modern reader going back and reading this. So the whole conceit of this gives Poul Anderson an excuse to be able to encounter magical things and explain them through a scientific lens, which is kind of fun and clever, but also really obnoxious at the same time because none of it feels natural to me. He fights a giant at one point and, he doesn't fight the giant. He knows that he can't take the giant, so they have a riddle off.
A riddle off?
Yeah, the riddle contest.
Wow.
Basically delaying so that the sun will come up so it'll turn the giant to stone, right? And that's what happens. The giant turns to stone. And one of the companions is like, oh, we got to steal his gold. He's got a bag of gold. And the other companion's like, no, we can't. Anybody who steals the gold of a giant who's been betrayed like this will get cursed. And after a couple seconds, Holger's like, oh, God, we got to get out of here because in changing from carbon, which is flesh, to silicon, which is stone, there is a radioactive isotope that's created. So it's all of this radioactive material laying there. So that explains the curse of the gold. They have to get out of there before they're irradiated and killed.
Okay, so we're talking about a guy who is ambivalent about God.
Yeah.
Who now suddenly believes in God, but I'm going to explain everything with science.
Yes, because he was a mediocre physicist.
Okay, sure.
And I don't dislike that, but I don't love it either.
I feel like they haven't picked a lane yet.
They don't. It's sort of an episodic book. First person he meets is a witch who summons a demon, which is pretty cool. She sends him off to find Lord Alfric, who's a fairy lord, who's basically, Oberon. Says that, Alfric could probably help you get home. She introduces him to Hughie, a dwarf, to act as his guide. Hughie has a lot of the characteristics of your very D&D dwarf. You can't give Poul Anderson credit for that because, there's a lot of stuff that goes into the dwarf. But you can see how he influences it lightly, the idea of the D&D dwarf. The dwarf kind of thinks that going to Alfric is a bad idea, so he introduces Holger to Alienora, who is a swan may, which is a woman who has a magical feather coat. She can turn into a swan at will, basically. And that's a classic D&D figure. It's also a figure in folklore, but, Monster Manual 2 has the swan may in it. It's sort of an odd monster to have in the game, but once I get through all of the influences, you'll understand why the swan may is a callback to this novel.
Yeah, because I'll be very honest with you. Up until this point, I'm like, all right, I've always had these thoughts about Appendix N where I know that there's a lot of great stuff on there that is integral to the formation and all the ideas that became Dungeons and Dragons. But I always wonder if some of these books just got on there because Gygax happened to have read it and he's like, it was a pretty cool book. I'll give the author the rub or whatever, because this felt like one that was getting the rub because I have no idea where this is going.
Oh, no, I mean, it's super important. And the reason it's important is super cool, but it takes a little bit to get there. Now, the other thing about this is that all of the characters that he meets along the way speak a dialect, and it's very Scottish, influenced. So like there's lots of apostrophes and slang that you don't really understand. So a 150-page book is suddenly like feels like 300 pages.
That's tough.
So the Swan May is obviously going to be the love interest for Holger. And another problem with the book is that the entire book is like horny and sexually frustrated. And it's not even undercurrents. It's right there on the surface. And Holger is a bit of a creep. So as soon as Alienora shows up, like the creep factor raises. And I read it all and I basically was just like edited it out. She's a cool character, but he totally undercuts her and makes it yicky.
So when she does make it on screen, though, in the book, in your head, did you hear the John Milius?
Kind of, yeah. She's definitely described as inappropriately young, but she's a badass. She turns into a swan and pecks dudes' eyes out. Like, that part's cool.
That rules.
And she has, like, a really strange character shift when they decide that they're in love. And that's kind of, like, gross. But, like, it's horny. It's totally horny. But then they go to the elf land and narrowly escape the elves. They go off to find help in the human lands. And now all of this feels very familiar to Holger. And he's starting to pull it together and realizes that he's sort of in, you know how they refer to the King Arthur stories as the Matter of Britain?
Right.
So France has a matter. The matter of France is all of the legends and romances surrounding Charlemagne. And he realizes that he's in the world of those stories because they start talking about Charlemagne. Carlson. You see? You see how it's starting to come together? All right.
All right. I'm getting what you're laying down.
They go off into the human lands looking for help, and they find a werewolf, which is actually a pretty cool episode. They're joined by this Saracen knight named Carahu, who is a cool, also very horny character. But you can see how this idea of like the traveling companions is very like a D&D party of murder hobos. They decide that they need to go get the magic sword Cortana, which is in a ruined church, and on the way they deal with the giant. Holger finds himself underwater in the lair of a Nixie, which this Nixie is very much the same Nixie that the Nixie from D&D is patterned on. There's cannibals in the hills, and then the Wild Hunt comes up, and
Wait, the Wild Hunt comes up too?
yeah, so they're just trying to get to this church where they know that the sword is hidden, and Morgan Le Fay is throwing everything at them. Morgan Le Fay is sort of like the villain. She doesn't want him to get the sword because, now this is where we're going to start getting into like okay, I understand why this is important to D&D. Holger is, like King Arthur, a hero who died and or was taken away to Avalon for Denmark's time of need. And he was taken out of the time stream by Morgan Le Fay's magic and then dropped into our world as a baby, where he grew up and started to fight in World War II. And then when Denmark needed him in Fairyland, Charlemagne time, it called him back through time. So he's fighting for the forces of law in both dimensions, right? Because he's a champion of law, whereas Morgan Le Fay and the fairies are champions of chaos. And this is the first time that law and chaos and those things as polar opposites of alignment is really used in fiction. And as much as I think that Michael Moorcock does this better with his Eternal Champion books, Michael Moorcock is obviously influenced directly by this book. This idea of this figure existing in multiple planes of existence as a pivotal force in the battle between law and chaos. That's totally Michael Moorcock. That's Elric, all of that stuff. And it's the alignment system in D&D.
That's amazing. That is so far out of left field. I didn't know that we were going to get there. And I'm like, how is he going to get out of this pickle? And that is cool. That is something really I would not have expected from a source like this, especially with the way you started.
Yeah, well, I did bury the lead intentionally. I have to keep the excitement and the drama going,
I appreciate that. That's strong work.
But I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to raise the stakes, because as interesting as that is, I think that alignment is actually one of the worst things about D&D. Because in the books, and like Moorcock and Anderson here, it's framed as a cosmic struggle, and it never really is in Dungeons & Dragons, not convincingly to me. Alignment has always felt like a guide to your character's behavior, and they aren't part of a larger ideological, metaphysical struggle. So yeah, it introduces alignment, but I also think that D&D never really did anything cool with alignment. And I like the fact that they're sort of phasing out that idea in the modern editions.
See, I like it too, and I think that after years of playing this game, it never actually works the way that I think they intended it to work.
Yeah.
I like it in the sense that, say if you have a magic sword that unless you are of this alignment, you can't use. or it's going to like, turn against you, or it's a curse sword, but if you're evil, keep on doing it. It's fine. That's where it gets its juice from. But actually, like, well, I'm lawful good or I'm neutral. Like, I don't know that most people get what neutral actually means and how that is in a role-playing sense. So I think getting rid of the alignments is going to be kind of freeing, to be honest with you.
I totally agree. But yeah, so there's something better in this book than alignment. So like I said, they're trying to get to this church. The sword is in the church. Morgan Le Fay is throwing everything at them. She's got cannibal tribes running. It's snowy. Hearn of the Wild Hunt comes after them. The Wild Hunt is sort of like an obscure bit of mythology. Like I had known about the Wild Hunt probably through the reference of deities and demigods. And I went back and looked for it because it's cool. I like that idea. But there isn't a lot to find. And I still don't really know much. I would say that the reason that the Wild Hunt is in deities and demigods is because it's in Three Hearts and Three Lions. But even cooler, so they have to get to this church. So they cut through these caves, and they know that there's trolls in those caves. But they're going to risk it anyway. It's the only way they can get away from the cannibals.
Real quick, cannibals, sure. After everything else, we're getting chased by cannibals.
Yeah, and they're pretty brutal. They're very much in the barbarian cannibal, like furs and scary. Like they lived next door and fought Conan's tribe kind of vibe.
Love it.
So they go into these caves. The dwarf carries them in the caves because he could smell the trolls, and he thinks that he can lead them through the caves without having to encounter the troll. But it doesn't work out. They encounter the troll. And the troll, I kid you not, is described as the troll in D&D with the pointy nose, the green skin, the Brillo black hair, the black pits of the eyes. And again, better than D&D because they go into the cave and they're like, okay, we're almost out. But I think that this is the lair. And there's all these skins and heaps of like trash, and it rises out of the trash and it's going ho, ho, ho. And it's so freaking scary.
I love it.
And it just laughs at them the entire time. It really like tears into him. It's a terrifying combat. It's the best scene in the book. They have such trouble with it. They hack off its arm and the arm like crawls back and reattaches. They don't know what to do for a long time. It's so terrifying. And like it's a shame that the troll in D&D is not that terrifying. But I think if I ever run D&D again, I'm going to make them that terrifying.
I mean, how could you not? This is pure gold Inspirato.
The end of the book is he gets the sword and he remembers that he's Ogier the Dane, who is like a prominent figure in the Charlemagne saga. And then he rides off and stops the fairy invasion. And then he gets stuck in World War II again. And he gets through the war and he doesn't die. And he's trying to find his way back to Alienora. That's how the book ends. Like literally in that sort of exposition, like where he's like, I'm talking to you and I made it back. And now I need to find a book that's going to get me back to where. And it's just like, this is how the book ends?
Yeah.
But if you don't want to read the book, and I don't know if you really need to, pick it up anyway and read the troll chapter because the troll chapter is that good. And like I was shocked. They talk about trolls throughout the whole book and they kind of build them up as like being terrifying, that no man has ever defeated a troll and like nobody knows why. And so like all of those things like build to this perfect head. And I really did not expect it to be the D&D troll. I expected it to be something more rooted in Slavic folklore. Like the giant, turns to stone, or like from Troll Hunter, like that kind of troll. I didn't expect the pointy-nosed troll. It's so good.
Well, you know what, man? Whether you are a kid when Gygax is a kid, reading books, getting that sweet Inspirato, or whether, you're in the modern times, in the 2000s, where you're seeing things and you're coming up and it kind of sparks that creative flame. Books like these are so important for the formation of future art and future adventures. So, man, I am totally excited to know more about Three Hearts and Three Lions. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on the book?
Yeah, I think it's interesting just because like these books are simultaneously better and worse than you expect on their own merits and in relationship to their inspiration of D&D. And I think they're fun and interesting, and there's a lot to get out of them, and there's a lot to like pick apart and make better too. It's like such a flawed list in a lot of ways. And I think that you get out of it what you bring to it in a lot of ways. And that's kind of cool.
And that, folks, is the best parts about D&D in a nutshell. You get out of it what you bring to it.
that's true too.
So this was another great episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They could find me every day on Instagram at Vintage RPG, talking about stuff like 3 Hearts, 3 Lions, and other books that inspired role-playing games.
Very cool. You could find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. You can also find my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you love the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. If you really like the show, check out our merch store. We have t-shirts, we got hats, we have got hoodies. It's like your favorite band, except for RPGs. And if you like the show, really like it, want to go to the prom with it, think about joining our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We got a ton of cool extra stuff over there, including access to a private Discord server and some other fun stuff in the works. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.